Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to is it May? The May meeting. May meeting. Gosh, year goes past, doesn't it? Both those of you who are here and those of you who are watching at home, welcome. Duncan will be reminding you about our next special meeting. I have just one announcement, and that is membership cards. Those of you who've been members for a while will know that we used to give out a membership card each year, and you especially used it for discounts in Novel Idea. And since we've been having Zoom meetings, a lot of people have not been able to collect their membership cards. If you want this absolutely priceless Kingston Historical Society special picture of the Murney Tower, and not only that, personally signed.
Discount it. Nope, the 10% discount, Novel Idea for being a member.
Sorry? Discount, yes, at Novel Idea, on any book, 10%, 10%. And you just go and smile and give you that, show them that. And so how can you turn that offer down? If you need one, you need to get in touch with Paul and we will arrange it. And unless anybody at home or here has other announcements, I will say, Duncan, it's your turn.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome to the fifth of our spring lectures for the Kingston Historical Society. My name is Duncan McDowell. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Ian McCulloch. Just by way of background, remind us that we pursue many themes in Kingston history. Railways, as we've seen this month, commerce on the lake, the military presence, higher education. Well, I'd like to suggest that tonight we're going to encounter another theme. That's the fear of invasion we've had in Kingston. When you think of our tourist attractions, the number one tourist attraction is Fort Henry and its partner, the Rideau Canal, both of which were built in the 1830s in case the Americans came. In the 1840s, in the Oregon crisis, we, or I should say the British, built 5 Martello towers on the perimeter defense of the harbor at Kingston. So we've had invasion on our minds. We're vulnerable, we feel, in this city. It was reiterated after Confederation when there was a threat of the Fenian raids, a kind of early form of terrorism coming across the border. They didn't come to Kingston. But whenever there is a military blip, Kingston became very aware of its military role as a defensive post in Canada. In both World Wars, the Barrafield area was full of soldiers who were not, of course, defending us against the Americans, but readying to go abroad to fight in the 2 wars. So, and almost preposterously, there have been articles written by conspiracy thesis people who argue that Fort Drum, that mega base that the Americans have in upstate New York, is in fact a practice ground for an American invasion of Canada. Now, as I say, we're well inured to conspiracy theses these days. Well, to tell us about one invasion that actually did happen in Kingston, Ian McCulloch is here to say. Ian was born in Halifax. He has academic degrees in journalism from Carleton and in war studies and war defense studies from here in RMC. He served for many years in the Canadian Army, and amongst other things in that role, he commanded the Black Watch Regiment, that famous Montreal regiment, and worked as the first deputy director of the Directorate of History and Heritage at the Defense Department. He retired in 2014 and had the good sense to move to Kingston, and has been active then as a very thorough and readable military historian, and with a particular interest in the 7 Years' War. And tonight he's here to, as I say, to talk about one invasion that actually did land on our, or the French, doorstep in 1758. And he takes this from his book on John Bradstreet's raid, 1758, which is for sale out front at a deeply discounted rate. Just show your card. So without further ado, I'll introduce John. Thank you, John.
Thanks for having me to talk about what I think is an important piece of Kingston's history. Certainly It occurred pre-loyalist, so. Okay, I'm gonna talk really loud too, okay? So, yeah, I don't have my book with me tonight. I have my last two books with me, which I have 5 copies of each out there. I'll be selling those for vastly reduced prices for anyone with a Kingston membership. I'd be happy to sign them for you after the presentation. Now, I've got other thanks to give, other than thanking you for inviting me, but certainly I've got Richard Preston, the former president of the society, to thank, the late Richard Preston, because he compiled the source documents, majority of the source documents that I used in the writing of my book, in his book, Royal Fort Frontenac. I've also got a good friend of mine who was here with the Kingston Historical Society, who mentored me on the 7 Years' War, and we did a lot of things together. We actually, he relieved me as the director of education and museum interpretation down at the Fort Ticonderoga Museum. Bob Andrews and his wife Betty is here tonight. Both Bob and Betty supported me as a young historian, and they edited my 2-volume history entitled Sons of the Mountains, which is a history of the 3 Highland regiments that came to fight during the 7 Years' War in North America. 78 Fraser Highlanders, we have a reenactment group still in Montreal. The 77th are Montgomery's Highlanders, and of course my regiment, the Black Watch Royal Highland Regiment. I'm going to talk today about a man named John Bradstreet, who I didn't know anything about until I came here as a young officer back in, 30 years ago. Young infantry captain, I came to Kingston. Everybody recognizes Fort Frontenac there. Prior to it becoming a staff college, it was an artillery barracks, the Tete de Pont barracks there at the Causeway. It wasn't called Fort Frontenac until the 50s, when it was re-rolled as an Army Staff College. But it's not the original Fort Frontenac. The original Fort Frontenac, which I call in my book the Underground Fort, is underneath the modern day Fort Frontenac, and also underneath some of the streets of Kingston. And you can see the map there showing the outline of the fort superimposed on present day Kingston. But a lot of people in Kingston have not been inside Fort Frontenac. They know that there's a demi-bastion outside the old Leon Center there. What have they renamed it? What have they renamed it? I couldn't. No, I couldn't believe it. Anyway, when they did the archaeology there and exposed that demi-bastion, a lot of people didn't realize that a demi-bastion has been exposed for many years. I used to walk past this every morning on my way to the officers' mess, which you can see in the distance there with its green awning sticking out. But we're looking at the remnants, or part of the remnants, of the Saint Louis bastion. And I used to look out every morning on my bedroom window right down onto it. And about halfway through my 6 months at the staff college, I actually stopped and I read the plaque. You can just see a plaque there. And it told me all about a guy named John Bradstreet, who had come to the fort in 1758 with a provincial force and some British regulars of about 3,000 men, and besieged the fort over 2 days. And then at the end of it, captured the fort, blew up the magazines, burned all the ships in the harbor, took 2 of the ships away with them. And essentially left, and nobody ever came back again until 1783. The French never reoccupied this fort, which they built in the preceding 40 or 50 years prior to Bradstreet showing up. This French map shows that tower that I just showed you a little more clearly. The other demi-bastion across from it is under Ontario Street. And that bastion up in the corner there, that's the one outside the other one. If you go to the other one, that's the one that's on display outside Fort Flunder. Now I'm gonna divide my little talk into about 6 chunks. It's gonna take about 45 minutes. I'm gonna first talk about who was John Bradstreet, for those of you that aren't au fait with exactly who he was in the pantheon of British commanders during the 7 Years' War. I'm going to talk a bit about the bateau service, which he set up as a logistician to improve the ability of the British Army to fight in the wilderness, away from roads, away from seaports, away from any sort of what we would consider today normal supply routes. I will christen the ground for you, which is an old Army term for, I will show you the geography, I will show you the terrain, because terrain can speak volumes. And I will orient you to the ground and talk a little bit about the 7 Years' War for those of you that are not familiar. Everybody knows that 7 Years' War includes James Wolfe at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. You're not too familiar with the other aspects of what happened in Canada during the 7 Years' War. I'll talk a bit about the genesis of the raid. Whose idea was it? The raid itself, we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about some of the after effects after the raid was over. This is John Bradstreet, or should I more correctly say Jean-Baptiste Bradstreet. His mother was Acadian. Her name was Agathe de la Tour, and she was the daughter of the famous, or the granddaughter of the famous Charles de la Tour, the first governor, the senior of Acadie. So he had mixed parentage. His father was an Anglo-Irish officer in the 40th of Foot, which was stationed in Annapolis Royal. His father died while he was quite young, and he and his brother grew up as garrison brats running around with their French cousins on their mother's side of the family. They also had many Mi'kmaq cousins, because Charles de la Tour famously had several native wives, and so the mother of Bradstreet had many stepsisters. So he grew up speaking fluent French and Mi'kmaq. He, in this painting, is 50 years old. We know when this painting was done because the artist worked in Albany during a set period of time. We also know that he wasn't really available for much of that time because he was sent off by General Gage to put down the Indian uprising, or the uprising of the Native Americans of the Ohio country and the Hoba at Detroit. And he was sent to try and relieve the British forces that were surrounded by Pontiac and his small army of besiegers. He, sorry, well,
People online are still having trouble hearing you. They're wondering if you could speak louder to see if that would help.
all right, but I don't want to blow the speakers. I can use my best pray down voice.
And I think the mic for the online is in the cameras, so perhaps if you brought it forward.
Oh, okay.
Don't touch it. So bring the other mic closer to the camera.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I-
From there.
we can, oh, okay, just bring.
And if he
everything
brings
forward.
this thing
Yep.
forward.
Yep, right.
Yeah.
Yep,
That mic
That's
is
fine.
closer.
Yeah, but you'll have to.
Okay.
This
Yep.
mic is for online, this mic is for the room.
Okay. Well, I need this. People in
Yes.
the room need to hear.
Yes, they do, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, where were we? Okay, we're back on Jean-Baptiste. You can see here, he's wearing an unadorned red tunic that was favored by most of the general officers. They didn't wear fancy uniforms in the bush. They took the gold gilt off. They took all the fancy buttons off. Just a plain red unadorned coat. You can see he's down half a pint. That's because he's just back from Detroit. He spent the last 4 months in open boats, and he's been wearing a flat hat over his head, and he's sunburned from there down. He'll be dead in 10 years. He's a heavy drinker. He'll die from cirrhosis of the liver. And he looks kind of unrepentant in this picture. He's being raked over the coals by his commander because he's arranged for peace treaties with various Indian tribes around Detroit without authorization from the commander-in-chief, without any involvement of Sir William Johnson, the superintendent of Indians. So he's incurred the displeasure of Gage. He's incurred the displeasure of Sir William Johnson, two of the most powerful men in North America in 1764. Okay. The raid that he conducted in 1758 was a tactical victory. Everybody thought that he had done well, but after several months of not receiving any word from London that he was going to get a knighthood or maybe another promotion or some sort of sinecure like the governorship of, I don't know, Newfoundland or Massachusetts, he wrote an account anonymously to toot his own horn. It's about an 18-page document. And this document is a very detailed account of the expedition from the beginning to end, but it's written by the commander. It's written by Bradstreet. It's in, every page it's Bradstreet did this and Bradstreet did that. We know it's Bradstreet writing because we found his journal, where his journal is found in George Washington's papers. When Bradstreet died, his journal for this particular expedition was left to Philip John Schuyler, his protege. And Philip John Schuyler ended up being the Major General commanding the Northern Department during the American Revolution, the next major conflict between the Americans and the British. Philip John Schuyler sends Bradstreet's journal of the expedition down to George Washington to read because there's interesting intelligence on various routes of how to get into Canada and attack Canada again. This is after the initial attempt by Benedict Arnold and Livingston to try and capture Quebec as the 14th colony. So when you read this account was used by Francis Parkman and almost every other historian after him to detail what happened on the raid. And of course, you're getting the whole point, POV or point of view of the raid is from a British commander's point of view. He even calls himself daring and brave in this account. So my background is in journalism, so I said to myself, well, the history of this raid, the history of this expedition is totally skewed. I mean, the famous historian, John Keegan, said one should never trust any historical account that is written by a commander, and it doesn't matter whether he won or he lost. He's gonna embellish it or he's gonna cover things up. So I said, aha. I decided to go back, take a second look at this account and fact checked it against provincial accounts. There was 3,000 provincials on the raid. So there had to be some journals, there had to be some diaries, there had to be some letters, there had to be French accounts of what happened. Francis Parkman and Gibson and all the successful succession of historians have all taken John Bradstreet at his word. So said, that's not going to happen. Early on in the process, I contacted my friend Pete Rindlisbacher, marine artist who most people here are familiar with. He's done a lot of artwork for the Maritime Museum of the Great Lakes. Almost any War of 1812, a sort of naval engagement on Lake Ontario or Lake Erie, you look down in the corner and Pete's probably done it. So I phoned him up and I said, Pete, you know Fort Frontenac and the whole story of the Vaudreuil and the Montcalm, the French ships that were there? And he said, well, yeah, I went to Queens. I studied psychology at Queens, but he quickly discovered that his calling was as a marine artist. So he now lives down in Texas, works out of there, but does all kinds of commissions for various folks. Yeah, and I phoned him up and I said, can you do me a cover for a book on the French, the fall of the French Fort Frontenac? He said, well, if you can send me what the fort looked like, if you can also tell me what the ship was like. So I gave him the dimensions of the ship and what have you. He actually has a 3D printer that he prints all his ships that he paints. He prints them out on this printer. He creates a model that he can use. So that's a pretty accurate representation of the Marquise de Vaudreuil, which was the 20-gun ship anchored just off of the Fort Frontenac as a shore battery the first night. But more on that a little later. And it is on the cover of my book because this event during the raid is not even mentioned in this account. And so when you find a major action on an expedition that is completely glossed over as if it never happened, something's rotten in Denmark. So I had to go back and start more fact checking. And that was the genesis of me coming to write the book, because the story of the raid is not Bradstreet this and Bradstreet that. The story is about the men that actually did it. The men that rowed the boats up the lake, the men that rowed the boats down the lake, the men that lifted the cannon, built the batteries, did the assaults, did the scouting, did everything. And they were basically 3,000 provincials drawn from the colonies of Massachusetts on the far right there, dressed in the blue uniform with the red facing. In the center, you've got a soldier of the Jersey Regiment, the Jersey Colony, the famous Jersey Blues. And finally, you have the guy in green on the end, New York Regiment. That's why later on during the Revolutionary War, the Royal New Yorkers, the Loyalists that called themselves the Royal New Yorkers, wore dark green uniform, because that's traditionally what the New York provincials had always worn. So this story, I decided had to go back and tell their story, not Bradstreet's version. I'm going to talk a little bit about the bateau service. This is the organization that Bradstreet put in place because when he was initially called to the theater of Lake Ontario, everything had to be done on the water. This bateau here, shown here, is the 1776 pattern, but essentially it was basically the British Admiralty deciding that we're building these all the time, we should have a pattern for them. Typically during the war, the 7 Years' War, Schenectady, Albany, and all of these towns on the Mohawk and on the Hudson built their own versions. So the Albany bateaus were a little bit smaller. The Schenectady boats were a bit bigger. They could be up to 40 feet, 45 feet long. There's a couple of reconstructed bateaus, but these were the workhorses of the 7 Years' War in North America. These were the pickup trucks. You'll see one of the draft plans there is actually for bateaus that were built here in Kingston. It's a 45 footer, I think. Now, the thing about bateaus is that they had a very shallow draft. And if you notice up there, It's flat bottom. It doesn't have a keel. It's a keelless boat. It has a flat bottom so that it can be rolled on logs. They can be stacked. The bottom of these boats were made out of white oak or hardwood. The sides of the boat were made out of pine, which often got bashed in. And so they would always carry a barrel of tar with them and extra staves for the boat in case they sprung a leak. But the bottoms were white oak because of the rolling, because of the stacking, and also the white water and the rills in the rivers that these boats went over, especially if they were heavy laden with 8 barrels and 12 men stuck inside. Bateaus could have a sail fitted to them. They also could have a small anti-personnel carronade attached or powderado attached to the bow of the boat as an anti-personnel weapon. They also used, for this particular raid, they also used whaleboats, which were a style of boat that the New Englanders brought up with them, which did have a keel. And they were the preferred boats used by the Rangers in any of the scouting companies that went out on a scout. You can see some Rangers here watching some Indigenous warriors pass by the mouth of a river. Now I'm going to christen the ground. 7 Years' War started in 1755 with George Washington, father of his country. Yeah. Father of his country, starting the war down at Fort Necessity, and then the war officially started the next year. So that's why it's called the 7 Years' War, and not the 8 Years' War. The war ended in 1763. Now this is a snapshot of North American theater, 1760. So 2 years after the year we're talking about. So in 1758, we're 3 years into the war. And the plan is that Amherst captures Louisburg and then sort of carries on to Quebec. And that Amherst down in Albany is going to thrust northward up the Lake Champlain axis up to Montreal. And essentially Montreal and Quebec, that piece of ground is the key terrain to capturing and conquering New France. If you can get your army to capture Montreal and Quebec, basically that New France in the bag. The only problem with the plan is that Amherst successfully took Louisburg, but Abercrombie got a punch in the nose at Fort Carillon, a place called Ticonderoga. And his army of about 13,000 men was bloodily repulsed in the abattis and the earthworks outside of Fort Carillon by a much smaller French force of about 3,000 men. They were dug in, they had trees felled in front of them, but the British were unable to capture the entrenchments and retired with their tails between the legs back down to Fort William Henry, the site of the famous Last of the Mohicans, for those of you that have seen that movie. Now I'm going to drill down into the area of operations. So I've already mentioned the Lake Champlain axis. There's Fort Ticonderoga where Abercrombie was repulsed. He had to pull back to Fort William Henry. And it's while he was here at Fort William Henry, wondering what he was going to do next, he'd already sent a letter asking Amherst in Louisburg for help. So it basically meant that Amherst couldn't go on to Quebec City. Amherst had to send 8 regiments down to reinforce Abercrombie on the Mohawk River. And he decided that while he was waiting to do that, he would let his ambitious quartermaster, John Bradstreet was not a colonel of a regiment or commander of any men. He only really commanded the bateaumen, which was basically logisticians like himself. He had argued that he should be allowed to go and attack Fort Frontenac, and that would relieve pressure on Amherst at Fort William Henry here. So after the Battle of Ticonderoga, Abercrombie lets Bradstreet take 8 guns and 3,000 or 5,600 men up to Fort Stanwix, which is located right where the Mohawk River ceases to be navigable. And he also takes 3,000 men down to Oswego. Now, I guess the point to be made here is that Oswego is the first place that Bradstreet encounters when he does come to this theater of operations. He is working for Governor Shirley, who has replaced General Braddock, who's been killed, unfortunately, down on the Monongahela. Shirley is now in charge of taking Niagara and establishing Oswego as a fortified forward operating base. Old print of Oswego, an old trading post up on the hill, an old fallen down stockade. But the British were building a new fort, Fort Ontario, up on the heights on this side of the Oswego Harbor. You can see some shipbuilding going on there. These are some of the traders' houses, and then you can see Pepperell's and Shirley's regiment encamped there. His job was to run the bateau service and keep Fort Oswego supplied with shipbuilding materials, guns, rigging, provisions, you name it, he brought it. And he did it with using his bateau service. Now, what happens is that in 1756, after Shirley has postponed the Niagara attack, and now Britain and France are officially at war, Bradstreet is caught on one of his convoy runs between Oswego and Albany when Montcalm pulls off a surprise attack and attacks Oswego, captures all the forts there, captures all the British troops there, captures all the ships that they're building there, burns most of them and takes them away. And so Bradstreet doesn't have any forts or anybody to work for anymore. So what happens then is that he then spends the next 2 years working for successive commanders. He works for Lord Loudon, and then when Lord Loudon is sacked for not taking Louisbourg in 57 out of Halifax, he's replaced by his second in command, who you see on the right there. That's General James Abercrombie, a Scot, who's considered to be a good second man anywhere, which is I guess a compliment. It means that he was good at administration and logistics. He was not a good field commander. He hadn't had much combat experience. And he fails at Ticonderoga, and he then gets sort of, I would say, bullied by Bradstreet into letting him go and do his thing that he's been trying to do for the last 3 years. And on the right here, you see his opponent, the French commander-in-chief in North America, the Marquis Pierre Rigaud, the Marquis de Vaudreuil de Cavignan. And he, very narcissistic, vain man, likes to think that he's a good tactician, great believer in la petite guerre. He's also served in the Compagnie Franche de la Marine as a young captain during the time his father was the governor of New France. So here we have a second generation of Vaudreuil as Governor General in New France. And his whole plan for 1758 was to attack the Mohawk Valley, but then gets talked out of it by the French regulars who called him Le Generalissimo behind his back. And his little plan to attack the Mohawk Valley has to be canceled, and those men have to be sent to Ticonderoga because Abercrombie is marching on Ticonderoga. So two fairly men that aren't really that tactically or operationally switched on. I just threw this map in because I like it. It shows Albany. Albany, of course, is where the army that went north to Ticonderoga assembled, but it's also where all the regiments that went on the raid assembled as well. And, you know, they were farmed out to places like Half Moon and Saratoga, Schenectady, and the other side of the Hudson River here. So when the forces go north to fight at Ticonderoga and lose, Bradstreet goes with them. A man named Charles Clinton, who ends up being second in command on the raid, gets sent up the river to find a place for a new fort. And they site the fort at a height of land known as the Oneida Carry. And the fort is sited on the site of General Webb's encampment of 1757. In the film Last of the Mohicans, Webb is the one that does not send help to Fort William Henry. So Fort William Henry falls. He's so afraid that the French might come up the Oswego River and Wood Creek that he orders all the forts burned. These forts were all fully built forts. He has them all burnt, and he has all the trees cut down on either side of the river here, creating a 3 to 4 mile long obstacle. But this is where the raid starts, and this is where the raid finishes. This is where Bradstreet gets given 3,000 men to go off and do his expedition. Stanwix will keep 2,600 men working on the fort, at the fort that's going up at Fort Stanwix. He gives Bradstreet 160 regulars of the British Army, but they're not marching regiments. They're the independent companies of New York that have been around since 1703. So most of the men in the New York independent companies are recruited locally. So most of them are American colonials, not really British regulars. They're wearing the British red coat. American provincials, already mentioned them, showed you pictures of them. They came from Massachusetts, the Bay Colony. They came from New York, and they came from Rhode Island, New Jersey, and New Jersey. Artillery was regulars, so you got 26 gunners. You've got 61 Rangers. This is the famous Rogers Rangers. Batomen, these were the specialists on the Mohawk and the Wood Creek rivers. These were the men that knew how to go through white water. They knew the safest places to run rapids on the river. And every one of the boats usually had one or two of these men, two of these experts, two or three of these experts in the boat. And then finally, you have 42 Haudenosaunee warriors that went on the raid. You read various accounts. Some historians say it was 42 Oneida. Others say it was 42 Onondaga, because sort of the head sachem that went with this contingent was an Onondaga. Redhead was his nickname. The historians that say, well, you know, it was sort of it was only a half-hearted support of Bradstreet's raid, because 500 Haudenosaunee warriors had gone to Ticonderoga and sat on a hillside and watched the British Army destroy itself, trying to get in through the entrenchments of Ticonderoga. They said, well, yeah, we don't want to go on an expedition against another fort and do what we saw the British Army do already. But there were Haudenosaunee that had not been at Ticonderoga, and they still wanted to participate and show their willingness to be British allies. And you also got to remember, too, that during this period of time, since 1703, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had been neutral, in that any Haudenosaunee that were fighting out of Oswegatchie or up Kanawake, up around Montreal, what were known as the Mission Indians, or the Christianized Indians that were Roman Catholic, those were not considered part of the Six Nations Confederacy. The Six Nations Confederacy had their council fire at Onondaga. And in fact, on the raid, George William Johnson states and we know this, that all 6 nations were represented on the raid, and that's very important. It really doesn't matter whether 6 Haudenosaunee went on the raid or 600 went on the raid. All 6 nations were represented, which then told anybody, any scouting or enemy forces that they met, or any other indigenous groups that they met on Lake Ontario, that this was a 6 Nations sanctioned event. And you better steer clear. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about surprise, and it's hard to get tactical surprise in the wilderness, especially in this theater of operations, because you basically had to traverse land that was controlled by the indigenous people. And they would always warn their relatives. I mean, everybody down in the 6 Nations was probably related through clan or whatever to folks up at Oswegatchie, because Oswegatchie had been founded by Onondaga and Oneida and Cayuga. They also had a lot of Abenakis and Indians that had relocated from New Hampshire. And they were located at Oswegatchie. The French knew that something was going on because the British moved guns. They moved a whole bunch of guns down onto the Mohawk River and up the Mohawk River. Some of them speculated it was to reestablish Oswego. None of them even imagined that an expedition was being mounted to take those guns to here, to Cataraqui or Frontenac. They did. They took 8 guns with them. In fact, I think I showed you, where is it? Oh, I'm using this one. See down at the bottom, you can see a little recapitulation, a tally at the bottom of what they took with them. So two brass Royal Howitzers, 4 brass 12-pounders, and a couple of iron 6-pounders. The French knew they were taking guns, so that they knew the British must be going for a fort. Maybe it was Oswego. But the only other 2 forts that the artillery could possibly be used against offensively were Niagara or Fort Frontenac. And one French officer said, well, it can't be Fort Frontenac because, or it can't be, Fort Niagara, because Niagara's smack dab in the middle of Seneca country. And the Senecas were very pro-French. So there was no way a large British force was going through Seneca territory. They didn't have approval. So by process of elimination, this French officer said, well, they must be going for Fort Frontenac. The name of the man was Charles Lemoyne de Longueuil. He was related to the commandant at Fort Frontenac. They were first cousins. He goes down on a mission down to maybe see if there's any interest in reviving Vaudreuil's raid idea. He takes presents with him. But he's not allowed to go up Wood Creek from Oswego. He's not allowed by his Indian allies to go up the river. And they say, well, the British are building a fort at Fort Bull, or Fort Bishop, is what they call Fort Stanwix. And they wouldn't let him go up the river. And he thought this was very strange. And so when he goes back to Montreal via Fort Frontenac, he stops in to see his cousin and say, hey, the British are coming on an expedition. I've been told by the Onondaga, who they were both blood brothers of the Onondaga. They both spoke Haudenosaunee. So they knew the force was coming. And so Anne de Noyan, 3 weeks before the raid actually happens, writes a letter down to the governor of New France and says, hey, my brother has brought intelligence that the British are coming and they're coming for me. And so Vaudreuil allegedly turns to one of the staff officers and says, well, what is it that makes this officer so afraid? And I can understand that arrogance because the Marquis de Vaudreuil had not hoisted in that the British had developed a new operational capability that did not require them to need an forward operational base at Oswego. I mean, Vaudreuil's reasoning was that I have 2 warships on the lake, they have no warships on the lake. I have a base on the lake, they have no base on the lake. How could Cataraqui possibly be in danger? So he just didn't hoist aboard that this new operational capability that Bradstreet had put in place was basically trialed by Bradstreet. It was basically a stage rehearsal for the attack on Fort Niagara the following year. More on that later. So there's this myth of total surprise that in his impartial account, Bradstreet writes that he surprised the French at Fort Frontenac. French knew he was coming 3 weeks before he even showed up. In fact, when he's 2 days out, somewhere off of Cape Vincent, he hears alarm guns being fired across the lake at Fort Frontenac, alerting everybody in the immediate area that the British are coming. But the Indian warriors that Bradstreet had with him were necessary because they did not know the way. The British had no maps. None of the British had been to Kingston before. Vaudreuil's sense of security was reinforced by the fact that, as I mentioned before, the English fleet that had been at Oswego, that had been built at Oswego, was captured by Communist forces in '56. The French had put 2 of the largest ships into, well, actually the largest ship, which you see there on the far right, the Montcalm. That was the HMS London, which was converted into the Montcalm and captained by the Sieur de la Bracquerie, who actually drew this map. This is actually a very nice map of Lake Ontario. And he decorated the margins of his map. Instead of spouting whales and mermaids, he drew the English fleet. And that's actually quite an accurate depiction of the English fleet in terms of the number of gun ports on each ship, the types of rigging that they had. And when I was down in New York State earlier this year for the French, or last year actually, for the French and Indian War College, or the 7 Years War College, they had an underwater archaeologist there who had been excavating or using ground radar and 3D imaging to recreate what the HMS Boscawen, which was a ship that they built on Lake Champlain for the same year to go up the lake to attack Montreal. And when they did the 3D imaging and sort of produced a replica of what the ship actually looked like, it looks almost exactly like these 2 ships that you can see here. Well, you can see this one clearly. You can't really see that one clearly. But you'll notice the length of the bowsprit. You think, oh, that must be exaggerated. No, it's not. You'll notice the masts are not straight up. They're slightly raked back. Those are almost perfect examples of Bermudan sloops, which were used by the Royal Navy at the same period for inshore operations in and around the Caribbean islands. And those Bermudian sloops are still used today. I think the Bermudian ones are made out of cedar, made of cedar. But more on maps later. Now here's a map. This is the first English map, British map done of Kingston or Cataraqui. And what does it say in capital letters there at the bottom of the map? Cataraqui River. What does it say? It says, head of the River St. Lawrence. They got it wrong. And so when you read some of the accounts of especially when you read the accounts of what happened to those two French warships that were floating batteries, and the men tried to escape, and then the ships drifted and floated away and ran aground somewhere near Kingston. Well, I did a lot of research on this, and I was helped by Sue Baisley, who everybody knows quite well, well-respected archaeologist, and John Grenville, my old buddy from Fort Henry Guard days, who's an expert on artillery, because I wanted to know more about the artillery that was found by the Loyalists and recorded by the Loyalists and is actually documented in Preston and Lamontaine's book on Kingston before the War of 1812. They recorded every gun that they found. Most of these guns ended up as ballast in the warships that were built in Navy Bay in the dockyard. And I think a couple of those guns that were captured at Oswego ended up at RMC as bollards, you know, by one of the gates there. But this map of Kingston shows the fort. Fort's not really properly situated to the ground. This is not geographically accurate. The engineer that drew it only had, you know, a day and a half to sort of pace things off. So the battery, you know, for example, that battery up at G, that was built by Bradstreet. That's up where the old brewery used to be. I think it's turned into condominiums now, but up on Ordnance Street, corner of Ordnance and Regent. And there's the tower that I look down on every day, which is really, he's got the fort around the wrong way, basically. But this is approximately where City Hall is. Sue Baisley said she did some digging there, and they found some traces of French embankments with gun ports in them. And essentially what Bradstreet did, I might be getting ahead of myself here, he used the French embankments that were already in place and placed his guns behind them and put holes through the embankments so that he could fire down basically across that parking lot that's there now, past the old S&M stores, and then down onto the fort itself. Now, who was in the fort when Bradstreet shows up on the 25th of August? Most accounts will tell you there was 110 soldiers in the fort, and this is all inflated rubbish. The actual nominal roll shows that there was only 53 Marines in the fort, most of whom were sick, lame, and lazy, because all the fit soldiers of the Compagnie Franche de la Marine were with McCulloch at Ticonderoga. This was a backwater garrison. Nothing was going to happen here. Vaudreuil said nothing's going to happen, so nothing's going to happen. But Vaudreuil had underestimated the British, and in particular Bradstreet, because Bradstreet wasn't going to stop at Oswego. He was just going to keep on going. So who else was in the fort? Well, there were 65 employees. The king's storeman, the surgeon, the priest, the bakers. There was 20 voyageurs in the fort. There were merchants. There were some retired soldiers. There were longhouses outside the fort. So they were inside the fort during the siege, the short siege, for a total of 118, which is probably where the figure of 110 soldiers comes from. We don't know how many folks were on the two French ships, the crews of the ships, and a detachment of gunners of the Canonnier Bombardier from Niagara, who show up the day before Bradstreet shows up. They show up on the Marquis de Vaudreuil on the ship, and they've come ostensibly to get stone, which I'm told was quarried over at Fort Frederick Point, and to take back to Niagara, because Niagara is just a big earthenwork fort, you know, and they use sods to keep everything in place. So every time there's a big heavy rainstorm, half of the walls fall down. So they had come to get stone to revet some of their gun emplacements. So they're immediately dragooned into service, and because they're trained gunners, they take over the command of some of the guns on the wall, and they also man some of the guns on board the two ships, which are going to be used as floating batteries. So the raid started on the 16th of August and it ended on the 3rd of September. And this shows you, I'm just going to recap the route that they took and some of the timeline. So they start here at Fort Stanwix on this height of land. And I call it a height of land because the portage was really a portage between the two watersheds. You got this watershed, the Mohawk, running down to the Hudson. And then you've got this watershed on the other side of the Adirondack Mountains that runs down through Oneida Lake and down through the Onondaga River to Oswego and into Lake Ontario. The only obstacle that they had on the way was the Oswego Falls, which were much higher than this. They look kind of inconsequential, but apparently they were about 20 to 30 feet higher. And they basically had to get all their boats out of the water at the falls located here. It took them 3 days to get everybody, 3,000 men and 80 bateaux, 8 cannon, out of their boats and then back into the boats. So there was a lot of making men done here as well. And at Oswego, they paused to take their breath before launching on the 22nd. Which ironically was the same date that Montcalm left after burning Oswego to the ground. They leave on the same day on their way to Fort Frontenac. By the 23rd, they're up to Sackett's Harbor, which they call Niort Bay. 26th, they're off of Cape Vincent. The problem is that the reason that they get to Sackett's Harbor on the first day is because they have the current, they have the wind behind them. And then the next 2 days, they have the wind, they have to row into the wind, so they can't use their sails. And they don't have the current either, because when the wind, as we all know, the 4 Great Lakes empty down into this lake, and they come down through the Niagara Gorge, and they create a counterclockwise current in Lake Ontario. And the wind was out of the southwest on the 22nd, and there was a nice, good, strong current, which could get up to anywhere between 1 to 1.5 knots. So that plus sail plus rowing, they make about 40 miles the first day, hugging the shoreline of Lake Ontario. They get up to Sackett's Harbor, headwinds. They get up to Cape Vincent, headwinds again. And then on August 25th, they're over on Garden Island, behind Garden Island, and Bradstreet gets out. He can see Kingston. He can see the masts of the ships behind Fort Frontenac, and every one of those masts is empty except for 2 of the ships, which have their sails furled. So he knows it's safe. He knows the French Navy isn't going to come out and attack him if he crosses at that point. It looks like they're snug as bugs in a rug. And so what he does is he crosses over around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. On the 25th, they come in a great long line, and then as the line sort of parallels Breakwater Bay here down by the Queen's campus, essentially you got Murney Tower here and the Gord Downey place on the other. They use that entire beach to land 3,000 men and their bateaux. They don't camp for the night. They lay on their arms. And then after last light, Bradstreet decides that he's going to take 20 whaleboats, fill them with soldiers, go up under the cover of darkness, hugging the Point de Montreal here, and attack and try and cut out the 2 ships that he saw furled in the harbor. Except that the French are fully awake. The ships are darkened. And they basically ambush Bradstreet's forces. They come up on him and just pepper his boats with grape shot, inflicting about a dozen casualties. But Bradstreet does not mention this in his impartial account because he basically got his proverbial kick on his first attempt at any sort of offensive action here at Fort Frontenac. So they scuttle back to the landing place. And then the next morning at sea, that basically, where a little creek came in, this is basically where the Kingston Yacht Club is today. In the little cove there, they landed, and all the artillery was landed here, and they set up their 3 howitzers just behind the crest of Mississauga Point, and start lobbing shells into Fort Frontenac. The French are also lobbing shells because they know approximately where the British are. And one of the journals that I found, the sergeant of the Jersey Blues was eating his breakfast in one of the boats here, and a French shell came over and landed just behind his boat, throwing up spray. So the French were firing blindly because basically all of this is in dead ground of the fort. In fact, anyone who's walked down here on a James Walker knows that this ridge line is still quite prominent today. It's quite a bit of a hill that comes down to where the condos now are located here on Point Mississauga. Now, Echo E, the dotted line represents the reconnaissance that Bradstreet takes when he the next morning after his failed night attack. He and the engineer go off and they walk along the shoreline and up into the heights above the fort. And they find a nice little spot that looks right down on the fort, right where that old brewery used to be. The brewery wasn't there then. And he decides that he's going to put a battery up there at night on the Saturday night. It's going to leave a force at A to guard the main camp and Point Mississauga. He leaves the Rhode Islanders and the Massachusetts men because they're not the best guys he has. He puts the New Yorkers and the Jersey men down at B under his second in command, Charles Clinton. And then he leads the New Yorkers and the Rangers and the Gunners up to Charlie and has them establish the battery there. First light on the Sunday morning, first light around 5 o'clock in the morning on the 26th. The guns, the battery that's being built up here, they cut the trees down in front of it. It's called unmasking the battery. If you're building a battery and you're going to fire directly on your enemy, you try and keep yourself hidden and covered up as much as possible before you reveal your battery. So at last night, they cut down the trees in front of their 2 guns and they opened fire on the Montcalm and the demi-bastion of the fort that I showed you right at the beginning of the presentation. And almost immediately, they knocked that bastion down. It crumbles because the fort is badly made. The plaster or the mortar between the limestone is, every time a gun is fired, falls into the cracks like sand. So the fort is not that robust. And so when the British guns open up at Bravo as well, it's just after Charlie starts firing, the folks here at B start firing from City Hall down onto the fort. And at about 8 o'clock, the fire is so heavy that the ships decide that they will try and make a run for it. But the Vaudreuil can only get, because there's a headwind coming this way, and it's fairly calm as well, the ship cannot get out of the harbor. In fact, it's raked by this battery very badly, and there's several casualties on board the Vaudreuil, but we don't know, because what happens is the crews of these 2 ships take to their small boats and probably end up somewhere just north of Berryfield going to them. Now, this is why I contacted John Grenfell, because those 2 ships ran aground without their crews aboard. Those ships actually were full, already loaded. With the Marquis de Vaudreuil, they hadn't had time to unload the first boarded that they were bringing from Bank. It's a transshipment post. And the other ship, the Montcalm, over here, de la Brockery's ship had been loaded up with muskets and powder and trade goods to go to Niagara. So one ship had come to Cataraqui, the other ship was ready to go on the return journey to Niagara. So when the ships were abandoned, they were quite heavy and they ran aground on the, I believe they ran aground on the Ilotero or somewhere on the shore farther up the Cataraqui River. And in order to get those ships off, they probably jettisoned a cannon on board them. And I wanted to know if the cannon that were found outside Fort any of the cannon were those ships' cannon, or if those ships' cannon perhaps, just maybe, are still lying in the mud up here. So if anybody knows any underwater archaeologists or divers that might be interested in chatting about this, I'd be happy to talk to them. But it's somewhere up there. So after basically punching well above their weight, these 53 men that had held off 3,000 British for 2.5 days finally surrendered. They ran up the White Flag at 9 o'clock. So it was about a 2-hour affair, the bombardment of the fort. That night, Bradstreet has 7 of the ships burned. And he keeps the 2 that have run aground. He's going to use those 2 ships because they've got sails and rigging and they've got all kinds of plunder aboard them. He loads his artillery up on those instead of putting them into his bateau. It's always wounded on board those ships. It's the New York Independent Company regulars on board those ships and then sends them back to Oswego. Except they can't get out that day either because of the wind is coming, just like it came head on for the French. The same thing happens to the British. And that's the remains of one of those burnt ships, which is, for some strange reasons, not in the Marine Museum, because you go to the Marine Museum and it seems that the marine history of Lake Ontario starts with the War of 1812. That's in Normandy Hall. That's in the Army Staff College building by the causeway there that they use for wargaming and exercise, tactical exercises without troops. That is the remains of the hero seen in that picture taken from de la Brockery's map. And the archaeologist that I know that's working down on the HMS Boscawen at Ticonderoga, very interested in coming and looking at how this ship is put together. So after the raid, Bradstreet takes all the powder that he can load on board the ships, the plunder, destroys everything else, tries to get all the cannons spiked. Most of the cannon that are found outside, ordnance that's found outside the fort, about 60 pieces of ordnance they find, is already been spiked by the French. So this is captured cannons from Oswego and the Fort Stone. Those cannons end up being used by loyalists as ballast. But one of the aftermaths of the raid is the whole story about the captives, the people that are captured inside Fort Frontenac, the men, the women, the children, the voyageurs, the bakers, and soldiers are all going to be taken by Bradstreet back to Oswego. And then he decides, well, I don't really have room for them. They'll slow me down. Why don't I just get them all signed up at a roll? And the terms of the capitulation can cover this. And then basically the French have to agree to return people of the same rank and the same occupation, the same sex as the prisoners that I'm releasing to you now and letting go back to Montreal. And some very famous folks are redeemed as captives out of New France as the result of the fall of Frontenac. Families in New England, and New York are reunited with mothers and children that have been taken over the last 5 to 10 years of frontier warfare. Most famous of which is this lady here, Susanna Johnson, probably the most famous Indian captivity narrative in North American literature. Her book went through 22 printings. The sad thing about this is that her 2 daughters were not free when she was free. Her son was. Her son, 8-year-old son, had been taken by the Abenaki and had become native and only spoke Abenaki. So when she got her son back, she got a little Abenaki person back who had basically spent the rest of his life as a native. He preferred it to, but he went back to his neighborhood and lived in his neighborhood. So this story got cut out of my book. Well, part of it's still in my book, but I had quite a nice annex, and I tracked down all the different people that got free because of the capitulation terms. I might actually gin that up as an article and put it in Historic Kingston, but I thought it was an interesting sort of social impact that you don't really think of when you think of a fort and a military action. Some of the effects, the after effects or ripples that occur after it. Now, one of the other big myths that Bradstreet perpetuated and then historians like Parkman and Gibson perpetuated, because they just copied him slavishly word for word, was that there was no casualties, or no casualties to speak of whatsoever. He claims in his impartial account that only 1 man was killed. Doesn't quantify it, doesn't qualify and say, well, I only had 1 man killed in combat. In the very outset of his impartial account, he says he has 2 men killed of his reconnaissance party as they make their way down the river to the lake. So how, this is another one of these facts that I had to check in the impartial account. Only 1 man killed in an expedition of 3,000 men? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't sound right. And so here you have General Stanwix, who's basically the guy that dispatched Bradstreet on the raid, writing to the commander-in-chief saying, hey, boss, they came back from the raid, but they're absolutely useless to help me with this operational task that you've given me of establishing this fort on the very important and strategic Oneida Carry. They're dying daily. They're just dropping down dead. We were dying from typhus. They were dying from dysentery. They were dying from smallpox. Actually, smallpox had already broken out in the troops that had been left behind. But these men came back. They were, I read some of the private journals and diaries of some of these soldiers. They were burying their friends at the various portages coming back out the river. They were dying of nervous exhaustion. One of the best sources I had was a sergeant in the Jersey Blues, and he said, well, I was sick before I even went on the expedition. He said, but when I came back, I started to feel really bad. And what he actually had was typhus. And friends of his around him were just dropping down dead. Just 1 minute they were talking to each other, and next minute they'd be dead. So this is another one of the hidden aspects of this expedition that we don't learn about if you just read the impartial account by the commander. He's not going to tell you this. The other important thing that came out of the raid, for me at least, was the capture of these maps, the capture of French maps. French maps done by the Sieur de la Braquerie and by the other captain, René Hippolyte Sieur de la Force. Those 2 captains were very good cartographers. They'd been sailing on the lake for many years, and all of those years of hard-won experience of best anchorages, where the sandbars were, where the reefs were, best, where there were dangerous currents. You'll notice this is just an excerpt of a much larger map, But on the Sieur de la Rockery's map, he had 4 inset maps of each of the harbors, the harbor at Niagara, Frontenac, the one at Oswegatchie. But as you can see, there's soundings on this. There's soundings on this map. You can actually see some of the reefs and rocks. So this is invaluable for an invading force. And so what did the British do with these maps? Well, they're immediately confiscated by the engineers. And giving those maps, I'm taking these back to General Amherst, and they get a whole bunch of other engineers working on it and copying these maps, because these are the first actual detailed maps that the British have of Lake Ontario. They captured them at Kingston. Now, this map is a map that is done up from the captured maps, and it shows a very accurate depiction of the south coastline of Lake Ontario from Oswegatchie, Oswego, all the way along the coast down to Niagara. And of course, that's the big expedition the next year. And then the big expedition that's mounted next year, they have maps. They know where they're going. They don't need Indian pilots this time because they know exactly where they're going. So important, a very important intelligence coup for the British. That same information, cartographic information, shows them the Thousand Islands, shows them the St. Lawrence River. And here we have a Thomas Davis painting, or Thomas Davies painting. He was a gunner with Amherst's army. This is a painting from 1760 showing one of the 2 French ships fighting off 5 British row galleys. These little row galleys had 1 cannon in the front of the boat. And you can see them. They don't have sails. They can row around, so they're not restricted in their movement, and they can basically avoid the broadside of the French ship, the Outaouais. Bob Andrews wrote an article about the Outaouais and its companionship. These were the 2 ships that Vaudreuil ordered built after he learned of Bradstreet's raid and the burning of the French fleets. He said, we've got to get at least 2 more ships built for the next summer. And this is one of the 2. It survived the campaign of 1759, and then it was captured and turned into a British prize in 1760. You can see Amherst's army in the little boats in the distance there. You can see boats coming down. They're on their way to, this is basically on the way to Montreal. And as far as I know, this is one of only 2 naval engagements that ever took place on the St. Lawrence River between the French and the British.
Yeah, what's in the foreground there?
In the foreground, we have Fort de la Présentation, and we have the Indian village of Oswegatchie, and this is a mission settlement set up by the Abbe Piquet in the early 1750s with Christianized Haudenosaunee and some Abnaki. And so you see them here watching the action take place. By this time, 1760, these Indians had been taken out of the fight. They'd been neutralized basically by Sir William Johnson said, if you take a knee when the British come down the Montreal River, you will not be harmed and we will look after you. So a lot of these Oswegatchie indigenous folk ended up guiding and acting as pilots on the trip down the St. Lawrence River. So I'm going to wrap up here. I think Bradstreet's main claim to fame is establishing the bateau service and being this man that developed this incredible operational capability for the British Army to operate in the North American wilderness. Basically gave them the mobility to move over inland lakes and river systems, and also a large lake like Lake Ontario, without the necessity for warships, stopping to build warships or stopping to build a forward operating base. it was basically go, 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 go. And here we see the British Army using that operation capability on their approach to Montreal in 1760 under General Jeffrey Amherst. And here they are shooting the rapids at Long Sault. Each boat has batomen in it. Soldiers, you can see an Indian war canoe there, the Haudenosaunee accompanying their British allies. And so the legacy of Bradstreet is as an innovator and as a logistician, highly valued by all his commanders. When not all the commanders successfully got fired, he was always there because he was an invaluable piece of what's to have. John Bradstreet. Now, just end up with, I thought when I was writing this book, kind of neat to find a guy who had been on John Bradstreet's raid and then came back in 1783 as a loyalist, saying, hey, I was here with Bradstreet and I had an opportunity to check things out. Couldn't find anybody. I explored the Michael Grass story. Didn't hold any water. Could not find anybody, but I did find a gentleman who fought for both sides that was there in 1758 when Bradstreet attacked. The captain of the Marquise de Vaudreuil, the Sieur de la Force, the one that, if you've ever heard a lecture by is it Robert Bates? Robert Bates wrote the book Warriors and Warships. He talks about the wharf over in Navy Bay being built by the Sieur de la Force. Well, Sieur de la Force was there in 1758, commanding one of his Catholic Majesty's ships. And then he was there again in Kingston in 1783 as Commodore of the British squadron. So he's the only guy I know in Canadian history that's been the Commodore of the French flotilla in one war, and then in the next war, he's the Commodore of the British flotilla. The Sieur de la Force was the only guy I could find. And I end with a Peter Rinlesbacher painting. And you can see the ships that operated on Lake Ontario were small and compact. And I believe that ship is the Seneca, one in this Peachy painting of 1784. I believe that is the Seneca. So that's the Sieur de la Force's ship tied up at the King's Wharf, or the old French King's Wharf. The reason they got La Force to site the wharves is because, he knew the water intimately, and he knew the best places for anchorage. So, ending with a Peter Rinlesbacher painting. I put the Peachy in there as well because I like the Peachy because it shows what the waterfront looked like before Progress took over. And most of this painting actually goes a little bit more, and I think it shows sort of the beginning of the hill that City Hall was built on. It was much higher in 1783. It got smoothed down and flattened down over the years. That could be the Sieur de la Force in his longboat from his ship. It seems to be a naval officer. And these are, of course, Anishinaabe or Haudenosaunee fishermen doing their thing. So there you have it. John Bradstreet's raid, 1758. Fairly quick and dirty overview of the raid by the book.
Ian, thank you very much. We do take questions now, both from the floor or from Zoom land. I might begin with one quick clarification. What's the difference between a regular troop and a ranger? Are the rangers like the Marines?
Yeah. Can we go to the last slide there?
Oh, yes.
Go to the last slide. quick answer is that Rangers were typically recruited locally. From the local woodsmen to act as scouts in the reconnaissance role. They were considered they were paid off of the regular establishment, but they were basically a provincial leader. In fact, two of Rogers' companies were actual indigenous companies commanded by white officers, so almost like a bit like the Gurkhas in the British Army. The Rangers, as I said before, that slide there,
That one,
go to that one there.
that one. Yep.
Yeah, so here you have sort of the typical, here you have the two, these are the soldiers at the private level.
Yeah, the people on Zoom cannot hear you.
Okay.
Oh, gosh, there you go.
Okay.
You're away from the.
Yeah, so here I'm back. The chap on the right is basically the far, is that the far right or far left? The your left,
Your left.
on your left, is basically what a ranger would look like. Not like your typical British recruit, though he was a regular. He'd have a cut down tricorn hat because the tricorn hats would get caught in the bush. So they cut them down almost like, no, the other hat.
I know,
Yeah.
that's what the trick.
They cut down their muskets too to make them shorter. They cut down their uniform, their tunic. They wore bearskin backpacks. They carried tomahawks. They wore moccasins. They didn't wear shoes. And around their legs, instead of spatterdashes, you see the Marine, the colonial Marine there is wearing spatterdashes on his legs there, below the knee, down to his shoes. Well, the Rangers were dressed Indian style, basically. He's wearing Indian moccasins. He's wearing what were known as Indian leggings or matasas. And his equipment and his uniform were usually dark green or a dark color of some sort. And they were also encouraged to grow beards as well. If they didn't have beards and they were going into action, then I've read actual instructions in one of the books that they were to smut their face, which just basically meant get charcoal from the fire and darken their face. So an early example of camouflage. So the Rangers were regulars, but they tended to be provincials and local folks that knew their way around the particular woods because they were going to be used in a very similar way that the indigenous folk were used, basically to scout and patrol and bring back intelligence. So, any other questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
Can one get into Fort Frontenac today for the public? Is there anything they can see and can they get in?
The only really thing that you could see at Fort Frontenac would be that demi-bastion that I showed you, which is basically in the parking lot. So I imagine the commissioner will let you walk in, take a photograph or look at that. But as far as the rest of the Fort Frontenac site, it's just a modern Army Staff College. The Normandy Hall has that remnant of the Hero because the Hero was found when they were digging the foundations for Normandy Hall over there at the fort over by the causeway there. They found the ship as they were digging the foundations. It was back in the 50s. And for some reason, it's still there at Normandy Hall. But, you know, now that we have a Marine Museum and a permanent location, maybe it should be, someone should talk to the commandant. Unfortunately, one of my former students, Richard Strickland, who was a commandant there the year before last, would be the ideal guy to ask because he was actually in one of my graduate seminars that I ran at the Staff College in Toronto, where we would look at campaign planning in Canada during the 7 Years' War, using modern day operational planning procedures just to assess the commanders, the folks, to see whether they knew what they were doing.
A couple of years ago, the parade ground there was redone.
Yeah.
And they have actually laid into the ground the markings of where the fort would have been, and it gives you a much better idea.
Is that over by the commandant's office?
As you go through the gates, the
Yeah.
one to the right, where the car park, in the middle of the car park, and if you look at what you're walking over, you do get some idea of what that tower would have been like. It's getting through the gates, it's the problem.
Ian, it falls to me to thank you for a fascinating talk. I think what you've done is reposition our feeling about military history. Most of us tend to think of military history as a nose-to-nose battle, where Wolfe comes out ahead of Montcalm. What you have been suggesting is that this battle was only 2 hours long, and what determined it was the logistics behind the point. That all the things of getting up the river, getting the boats, that's what turns battles. And it occurred to me listening to you how familiar that is to us now. The last 2 months, we have agonized over the American Congress providing the logistics for the Ukrainian army and getting it into the field behind the front. That's what battles hinge on. And Bradstreet may have been long, long ago, but he was teaching us a military lesson that is still relevant today, I think. Now all we have to do is face the annual invasion of American tourists, who pose another threat. But on behalf of the society, I'd like to thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you all here and out there for coming tonight. And I'll remind you of 2 things coming up. As we always have on the 6th of June, the day that Sir John A. Macdonald died, we have a commemoration, a celebration of his life at the graveside in Catarockway Cemetery, 2 o'clock? 1 o'clock. It will be on our website. It's definitely not at night. 1 or 2 o'clock, it's on our website. We have a guest speaker coming from Parks Canada to talk about the repositioning of Sir John in the local history. As you know, Bellevue House is about to reopen with Sir John still prominent, but now with a broader perspective on our history. So that's June the 6th at Catarockway Cemetery. And we will next meet in September on the 15th for our first fall lecture, at which time the Kingston lawyer Alan McLeod will be with us to talk about his research. Now, Ian likes battles, Alan likes beer. And he will be talking about the tradition of brewing in Upper Canada in Eastern Ontario in the early 19th century. So if we can arrange it, we'll arrange with the good folks upstairs to serve some beer at that lecture. So that's the 15th of September. Be on our website, and we look forward to seeing you then. And in the interim, have a good summer. Thank you.